I opened as white with d4 as usual, following my man John Watson's strategic chess opening for white. d4, d5, c4, knight to f3, knight to c3, e3. Now we're in the classic Queen's Gambit declined, and we go into the exchange variation when I take the pawn here. Now, the more common move here is this pawn, the E pawn takes the D pawn back, but another variation is where the knight here takes the pawn, and it looks a little similar to the Grunfeld opening that I came across when I lost to a 13-year-old girl at the chess championships. The difference being that this pawn here in the Grunfeld variation is advanced early. Anyway, Dr. M took my pawn with his knight. I then advanced my D pawn, and the more common response is for the knight, a knight exchange down here, which will leave white with a pawn majority in the center. But Dr. M played another variation, which I don't think is so good. You can see the advantage bar tips a little in white's favor over here as the knight retreats up here. In the Grunfeld variation, by the way, where this pawn is advanced here, retreating the knight back to b6 is a viable option, according to John Watson at least. However, we're not in the Grunfeld variation here. We're in the Queen's Gambit declined and a variation of the exchange variation. When I saw Dr. M move his knight back here, I was racking my brains to think how best to take advantage of this retreat. You can see that the Lichess computer, the Lichess engine, is recommending bishop to e3, which of course is then eyeing up the knight on that diagonal. However, I wanted to bring my knight. I wanted to bring my G knight to f3, but I didn't want to do that until I had advanced the f pawn. As the knight has retreated from the center, it seemed to me to make sense to advance my pawn and build up the center, but I wasn't sure whether this was really the correct thing to do or not. Happily, I see that the engine, the Lichess engine, doesn't really react too badly to that move. So I have a big center, and I'm preparing to advance my knight behind this pawn here, which will then add support to this to the Queen's pawn, the D pawn. Yes, at this stage, a c5 advance is to be looked for, but it didn't happen in our game. What we saw instead was an attempt to pin my knight to the queen, bishop to b4. The engine is recommending an immediate advance of the A pawn, but I held off from that. I thought that position can wait while I develop a piece. So I brought my knight out. There's not much difference in the advantage bar. And so then the next move, I think, is a mistake. Watch what happens to the bar. Still, the c5 break is recommended, but that didn't happen. You see, the queen was moved to e7, presumably to offer some support or supposed support to the bishop over here, but it's really not a very effective move. Keep your eye on this bishop. This bishop gets hemmed in. By moving the queen here, one more retreat or two more retreat squares have been cut off for this bishop. The bishop still has the option of exchanging for the knight down here, but the retreat squares are running out. They're running low. This bishop's options are gradually running down unless he goes for the exchange. I continue to develop my pieces. I brought my bishop out to d3, which now enables me to castle at will. He brings out his knight to c6. I still don't advance that pawn. I castle, and the response here is d7. Dr. M is looking to castle. I jump into that hole with my knight. There's a nice hole in the defenses over here, which is immediately eyeing up this pawn. And if that move came off, we'd have a nice check with a forking the king and the rook. So we have a look, and in moving this knight forward like so, it gets it off the bishop hook. So now this bishop is sitting in the middle of thin air. I really want to use my knight. I don't really want to exchange it for this bishop, especially as the bishop is fairly weak now. It's hemmed in. The bishop only has two escape squares, this one here and this one here, and neither of them is very convincing as an escape. Looking at this threatened pawn here, the engine is recommending a cautious retreat of the queen. If you make a mistake, it's probably worth spending a move correcting your mistake by moving back. Castle out of trouble, giving up that pawn appears to be another option. But, well, there was a castle, but it was a queenside castle, and the advantage through that move to white increases. Why is that? It's because now we've castled on opposite sides, and my structure is pointing to the queen side. Once this bishop is out of the way, we've got a lot of room to bring our pieces, our rooks and our queens, into a queenside attack. So as soon as the queenside castle took place, it now looked like a good time to hem in this bishop, and build up the queenside attack. That's what happened on move 11. A3 finally gets in. Now, I was wondering what a good response from Dr. M could be to this. There are not many options for retreating. If he retreats here, this pawn jumps in here, and there's an unfavorable exchange as far as black's concerned. If he retreats here, he immediately gets taken. If he retreats here, this pawn can hop in here, and it's goodbye to the black square, black bishop. I was looking at the move which the engine recommends, and in fact that's what Dr. M did. It's not a very convincing move really, but it's better than nothing. When under pressure, when one piece is under pressure, a good way to respond is to place something of your opponent's under a counter pressure. That's what seems to have happened here. It looks like it could just be an exchange of minor pieces, but there's a nice little move which the machine recommends, and I'm happy to say I picked up on it in the game, and that is to grab that pawn in front of the queen. The knight hops in, grabs the pawn, the C pawn, weakening the defensive structure around the black king. The bishop did not retreat here. What we had instead, the bishop should definitely retreat. You don't want to lose your bishop. But we have instead the king takes the knight. Do we have the king takes the knight? It seems to give white a slightly increased advantage. We take back here, recommending that the knight takes the pawn to put the knight forward. Perhaps Dr. M didn't want to do that as it seems to expose the king, but a forward knight here is always a threat. He's protected by the queen. He's looking at this bishop, so white may have to take a bit of care if that happens. I'll just hop it in and see what happens. Okay, not too much happens on the advantage bar, but that move was not played. Instead, it was the queen which took the pawn. Queen is brought out. Seems like a little bit of a risky move. I put my queen up to c2, eyeing the line here, pinning the knight to the king. The king is sensibly moved away from that line, that file. I then brought my bishop out to d2. clearing the way for my rooks to come in. The machine recommends this queen retreats because clearly this rook wants to come here where it's on a very strong file, looking at the queen, looking at if the queen moves away, an unprotected knight, and looking at the king ultimately. So the queen should really retreat. Dr. M notices that and does indeed retreat the queen, but not to d6. He retreats all the way back to e7, which only increases white's advantage. Why is that? It's perhaps because by coming here, he's looking at this weak pawn. There's also this pawn here, which is a little weak. So I would have to be careful in how I played from there. Let's see what happens. We go back one move. Okay, let's put the queen there where the machine wants it to go. Immediately, an advance of the pawn is recommended. An advance of the queen to cover that pawn, which is now attacked by a knight and the queen. That didn't happen, however. By retreating to e7, it makes my job easier, though I didn't necessarily play as well as I should have done. In fact, my next move is really a wasted move. I moved my rook to e1 to I the queen, thinking about future pawn advantage, which might expose that queen's file. But as you'll see, it was an unnecessary move because the rook simply later on moves to a better square. The advance of the knight here to attack the queen and look at the bishop is recommended. The queen would have to retreat down here to maintain support to the bishop. However, that didn't happen. I think there's a series of weak moves by Dr. M, which simply enable me to win quite quickly. He moves, look at what happens to the advantage bar. He moves his rook across, thinking about being able to attack the queen, but it hems in the king. So indeed, I follow the recommended move here, move my queen up. I'm now eyeing up this unprotected knight and looking straight through at the king as well. If that knight moves away, you have a pinned pawn here, and keep your eye on this rook looking at this pawn. Now, at this stage, so clearly the machine is recommending the queen should move back to here to protect the knight and keep the knight in front of the king. At this stage, there is a massive blunder, which is a game loser. I think what Dr. M is looking for is some counterplay, but he's not in a position really to offer counterplay when he hasn't first of all secured his king's safety. On the first day that I was in Hull, the Monday evening, Charlie Story, the guy who wrote The Sniper, he gave me a lesson. He owed me a lesson, and one thing he emphasized was king's safety as being the first thing you look at in a game. How safe is your king now and in the future? In this position here, the black king is not safe. Not only that, this piece here is exposed, is en prise, as they say. So the queen should move back here to strengthen the defenses around the king and to protect that knight. That didn't happen. Dr. M was perhaps looking for some counterplay in the center. He moves his pawn forward, and so the knight falls. It's really the end game is now near. He continues to try and make some counterplay in the center. This is a disaster. What he hasn't seen is that I simply can take this pawn. It's an easy kind of move to miss at the lower levels of chess, but how is it this rook can take the pawn when it appears that the pawn is defended by the A pawn seems to be defended by the B pawn, but it's not defended at all because the B pawn is pinned to the king by the white queen. So this pawn cannot take back, and all it does is opens a highway down the A file to the king. And if I can find a way to get my rook safely onto the A8 square, it will be checkmate. The king cannot move. If you remember a few moves ago, the king got hemmed in by this rook move here. So the king is stuck. The only hope is this knight coming in here, or as is offered by Lichess here, a queen for queen exchange. It's a forlorn hope, and in fact it didn't happen. Instead of defending his queen, Dr. M is still looking for some kind of counterplay. It's a matter of priorities here. He moves out, and this is a game loser, because all I do now, I don't need to worry about this exchange at all. Is simply move my rook across, and he can't prevent checkmate down here. He can only put it off. At this stage, Dr. M resigned. If we follow through with the recommended moves, so if we do that, then we simply take here. We have a counter attack down here, but it's still a forlorn hope because the bishop simply takes the rook. Now the king runs to safety, but we get in check. The king moves here, and there's some material to be grabbed over here, but why not bring another piece into the game? There we go, checkmate, game over. Absolutely no need to take that piece of hanging material over there. Don't just go for the hanging fruit when you can attack the king and get checkmate. So a very entertaining game. Less than 9 minutes used up on my clock. Very satisfactory. It was a great pity about the blunder a few moves ago by black, leaving that unguarded knight over here. That's what polished off the game. However, we started this game quite late, so I was expecting to miss the last tram home and have to run for the last train. The train station is somewhat further away than the tram stop. So thank you very much for enabling me to get in a quick victory and head for home on the tram. That's all from me, the pub chess bluffer, feeling chipper here in Hiroshima. Until next time, David Hurley of EasyChessTips.com.